Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Anne Collins-Goodyear, co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Isabelle Gapp, an assistant professor and interdisciplinary fellow in the Department of Art History at the University of Aberdeen, where she is co-director of the Center of the North and is part of the preview of things to come. I'm dying to hear this talk. I'm going to stand over here. I'm obviously very excited. So as you can see, she is co-director of the Center of the North, as well as being part of the Cryosphere and Climate Change Research Group. An active environmental art historian, Dr. Gapp specializes in art made around the Circumpolar North from 1800 to the present day. She is the principal investigator for the British Academy-funded project From the Flow Edge in collaboration with Dr. Sarah Cooley of Duke University and the West Baffin Cooperative in Kinget, Nunavut. She is also the co-lead for the Teaching Arctic Environments project with Dr. Jonathan Payton at the University of Manitoba, and in collaboration with Dr. Nadine Fabi at the University of Washington and Dr. Penny Howe at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland. Dr. Gapp serves as an editor for the Network in Canadian History and Environment, where she also convenes the Visual Cultures of the Circumpolar North series. Interested in the methods and technologies of art making by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists in the Arctic region, as well as the relationship of art to colonial projects and to a landscape impacted by climate change, Dr. Gapp has published extensively, both for scholarly audiences and the general public. And she is the author of the new book, A Circumpolar Landscape, Art and Environment in Scandinavia and North America, 1890 to 1930, published just last year with international support from the New Foundation for Art History, the Association of Art History, and a Kungliga Patriotska Sällskapet publication grant. And as you can see, the work that Dr. Gapp does is emphatically international in nature. Today, Dr. Gapp turns her attention to Anna Boberg, a Swedish artist who largely dedicated her practice during the last 30 years of her life, a period corresponding to the first 3 decades of the 20th century, to documenting the glacial landscape of the Lofoten Islands and the colorful illumination and communities that animate this area. Dr. Gapp's groundbreaking work on Boberg has been featured in a number of her recent publications and was the subject of an exhibition she curated in the summer of 2024 in London in partnership with Ben Elwes Fine Art. Tonight, she will have an opportunity to share some new discoveries about the painting that you see here on the screen, the blue roof now hanging across the quad over at the Museum of Art. And I hope if you have not already had an opportunity to do so, that you will avail yourself of an opportunity to see this fascinating work in person. And now I hope you will join me in welcoming Dr. Isabelle Gapp to Bowdoin. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm a little worn out from hearing about what I've been up to, but I'm very excited to be here with you all. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the honestly more than warm welcome I've received today while I've been sort of hopping around campus. I have no sense of direction today, but I think I've seen a lot of it. And so again, it's really nice to be here to be able to talk to you about an artist that I've spent a good part of a decade with, writing about in various circumstances, from a PhD thesis through to a book, through to kind of ongoing musings around her work that continue to kind of percolate in the back of my mind. So, as with most art historical work, it starts with an exhibition. So in December 1912, a touring exhibition opened in New York to mixed reviews. Its organizer, the art critic and curator Christian Brinton, saw this exhibition as a chance to reveal to Americans, quote, Scandinavian art as it actually exists, end quote. For Brinton, American art had yet to reach the standards of its Scandinavian counterparts, where, by quote, current European standards, we, America, are distinctly behind the times when it comes to matters of aesthetic development, end quote. The exhibition of contemporary Scandinavian art included among its 165 artworks by 45 artists, a number of the foremost landscape painters of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Much like those collective displays of Scandinavian art in the United States that preceded this large display, notably the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago, the format prioritized distinguishing individual national identities within Scandinavia. Brinton specifically intended these works to showcase the richness and diversity of their local and, by virtue, national environment. In an article written for Scribner's magazine, Brinton wrote that there is, quote, beyond question, a marked affinity, both ethnic and aesthetic, between the three nations. Yet the art of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway is nonetheless in each case distinctive, as much so as the language or physical characteristics of the countries themselves, end quote. Aided by three of the leading art critics and curators in the respective Scandinavian nations, artwork was selected based on how it might, quote, promote national modernism. The contradictory nature of Brinton's curatorial endeavors to represent individual nations with the intent of making American art more international is perhaps, though, one of its greatest successes, and one many exhibitions of Scandinavian art that followed sought to and still appear to emulate. Elsewhere in my work, I have argued that despite the growing persistence of cross-border issues today, by dissolving national boundaries in the history of art, especially as it pertains to the study of landscape painting, we might move away from the edges of the map and instead look to the fluidity and simultaneity of our natural environment. The potential effect of the 1912-13 exhibition was, however, swiftly eclipsed by the avant-garde display of the 1913 inaugural Armory Show. For the critic James B. Townsend, when taken as a whole, the Armory Show was, quote, a clean, strong, and varied one, and of vast artistic, educational interest and importance, end quote. In a review of the 1912-13 exhibition written for American Art News only 2 months earlier, Townsend was forthright and unwavering in his opinions. He commented on the failure of the exhibition, quote, that was chiefly due to the fact that Scandinavian art does not appeal to American art audiences, end quote. His true disdain, however, materialized in this scathing assessment of the Scandinavian landscape. Quote, the Scandinavian countries are cold countries. Their natural scenery is one made up of rock-bound coasts, frowning cliffs, deep dark fjords, lofty darksome mountains, with stretches now and then of fields, meadows, and chains of lakes and archipelagos. For the most part of the year, except during a short, hot summer, it is icebound and snow-covered, overspread by a leaden sky. Really telling us how he really feels. Small wonder, therefore, that the majority of Scandinavian painters fail to understand or are unable to get the sparkle, light, colour, and joyous atmosphere known and loved by Americans, and those of other climes where southern suns more warmly shine. So the AAC geographer, Jen Rose Smith, refers to what Townsend is really grappling with here as temperate normativity, where, quote, Arctic spaces are produced as inferior, where they are barren, white, desolated wastelands. And yet Scandinavia, and by virtue the Arctic, was not an environment devoid of sparkle, light, colour, or joyous atmosphere. as I will return to later on in this talk, by moving away from earlier accounts of and reflections of the Arctic as a white, barren, cold, inhospitable space, an art history of the Circumpolar North instead encourages us to reconsider it as a tonally varied, inhabited, and nuanced environment. Townsend's opinions were, unsurprisingly, not shared by everyone. In writing about the Swedish section in particular, the art critic Elizabeth Luther Carey described the landscape painter Gustav Fjärstad, renowned for his close-crop perspectives of snow-encrusted winter landscapes, as offering a remarkable interpretation of snow. In a piece, though written during the tour, the Norwegian-American critic Jane Nielsen Lauvik, who had assisted in the putting together of the exhibition, but the Norwegian side, not the Swedish, further remarked that the general public loved the photographic verisimilitude of Fjärstad's winter landscape, and yet he felt that the Danish and Swedish sections stagnated when compared to the Norwegians, notably Edvard Munch. He said, Munch caused such a stir, Munch and the Norwegians and Danes caused such a stir that, quote, without them, the exhibition would not have stirred the slightest ripple upon the surface of current events. A similar exploration of the winter landscape with which Scandinavia, the Nordic countries, and the Arctic are associated could further be found in the work of the sole female artist of the 1912-13 exhibition, the Swedish landscape painter Anna Boberg. So with this talk, I'm not aiming to be comprehensive or go into exhaustive detail about her work specifically, especially in the content of the wider narrative that I have thought about it regarding the Circumpolar North. Instead, what I'm hoping to do is offer a glimpse into the life and work of an artist whose creative practice was rooted in a specific local Arctic life and industry, and yet whose landscapes offer a timelessness that remains palpable even to this day. So, who was Anna Boberg? Now, I very rarely get to stand up and talk to anybody for 45 minutes about this artist, so I hope you'll indulge me a few moments of biography, which I tend not to talk too much about. So Boberg, for those that don't know, was the 6th of 7th children. She was the daughter of Karin Nyström, the co-founder of the Swedish branch of the Theosophical Society, and the daughter of Fredrik Wilhelm Schorlander. Her father was responsible for buildings such as the Stockholm Synagogue and the now former Royal Institute of Technology building in Stockholm. One of her sisters, Ellen, pictured here, would later marry the Swedish historical painter Julius Kronberg. Little is otherwise publicly known about Boberg's childhood and upbringing. In 1884, despite her mother's initial hesitations, with her father having died in 1881, Boberg became engaged to and later married the architect Ferdinand Boberg, again, a young version seen here. The latter was to become one of Sweden's leading architects, responsible for a number of state buildings and private villas on Stockholm's prestigious Djurgården. And many would say that it is because of his fame that her own success has kind of been overshadowed. These included homes for artists, collectors, and members of the royal family, including Prince Eugene and Prince Carl, brothers to the then Crown Prince Gustav. An infinite web of social and professional connections reveal themselves in the Bobergs' lives. Married for over 50 years, the Bobergs never had any children, but a handwritten note appended to Anna's unpublished sort of anteckningar, or sort of diaries, commentaries, within the Royal Library of Sweden archives, following her death in 1934, Ferdinand added, quote, "You, my beloved, my enchanting, my adorable wife. An infinite thank you for all you have been to me for nearly 50 years of unshakable unity," end quote. Without any formal artistic training, Boberg was only very briefly enrolled at the Académie Julian in Paris in 1884. Her exposure, however, to the Academy lifestyle, popular among her colleagues, was short-lived, but nevertheless informative. A contemporary of the Swedish Impressionist painters, Eva Bonnier and Emma Lovestedt Chadwick, who similarly attended the Académie Julian during the 1870s and early 1880s, Boberg was undoubtedly exposed to stylistic trends prevalent among her peers. Examples of her work made pre-1900 include the watercolor Summer Landscape from Stockholm, or in Stockholm, seen on the left. The initials here signing the work, which you can just make out in the bottom corner, BAS, suggest it was painted after she was married, but not yet having given up her maiden name, Sjolander. It is also during this time that Boberg appears to have started working in watercolor. Now, this is something we won't see in the Lofoten paintings from 1901 onwards, or at least we haven't seen in the Lofoten paintings from 1901 onwards. Forest Clearing, held within the collections of the National Museum in Stockholm, exhibits a very similar palette, where a green and a brown amass in front of the sliver of light that emerges through this clearing in the forest. It also evokes the work of contemporaneous Swedish artist Oscar Bergman, known for his watercolors and pastel drawings. Bergman similarly received no formal artistic training, but is reported to have painted 1 or even 2 works in a day, taking long walks in the morning and painting in the afternoon. Passing out the details of the landscape through the fluttering golden leaves against the wash of green that denotes the river, Boberg's watercolor is evocative of that fugitive intangibility of watercolor. Water sets the color to the paper as water flows past the artist while she paints. Water appears to froth on the surface of the flowing river as it eddies around boulders protruding from the water's surface. Beyond the silhouetted brown leaves of the same tree, the river turns into a wash of white and blue, signaling the direction of the sun. With this, unlike many of her other paintings, Boberg offers a momentary yet detailed glimpse of a suburban summer landscape. Through these earlier studies and in drawing parallels with other watercolorists and proponents of landscape painting such as Bergman, we might begin to understand Boberg's evolution as a painter, from an artist attentive to environmental details to one more largely concerned with the effects of the environment. Boberg, alongside Bonnier and Loveset Chadwick, was among others also included in the Swedish display at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. This was in 1896, followed by an exhibition of Swedish art with pieces sort of staying on. She was also featured in the Art and Handicraft in the Women's Building. So again, her work was sort of being taken out of that national context. Here she had 4 works on display, including watercolors of Venice and this decorative folding screen in the center. This penchant for the decorative continued throughout her life and included tapestries, textiles, costume design for various operas, murals, and ceramics. And this is a piece currently on display at the Met. The Bobergs also traveled extensively throughout their marriage. In addition to a number of visits to the Mediterranean, including France, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Turkey, they traveled to Jerusalem and Egypt in 1921. In 1926-7, the couple accompanied Crown Prince Gustav Adolf, later the King, Gustav VI Adolf, and Lady Louise Mountbatten on a state visit to India. Boberg, from this, published an account of their experiences of Indian culture, religion, and architecture in Genom Indien i Kronprinsparets fotspår that was published in 1928. This is one of 2 books that she wrote as kind of a memoir. She also documented these travels visually, with paintings depicting the villas of Sorrento, Spoleto, and Lake Como, the Dead Sea, and feluccas on the Nile. These visits all took place alongside a nationwide, multi-year road trip by the Bobergs to document and visually record traditional Swedish architectural heritage at risk of disappearing. Driving themselves around Sweden, traveling from south to north, they began their fragmented journey in 1916. Over 10 years, a total of 3,500 graphite drawings were made primarily by her husband Ferdinand, with Boberg herself seemingly having created few drawings of her own country. Importantly, paintings of Sweden more generally in her oeuvre are notably absent. By the time of the 1912-13 exhibition, Boberg's art almost exclusively reflected the inspiration of the Lofoten landscape. Such was the abundance of Boberg's career that by 1912, so she started painting there in 1901, there were over 400 small sketches in a fireproof vault in Stockholm. Carefully preserved, and this is a quote, carefully preserved not only for their artistic value, but also for the accuracy of detail which makes them historically valuable. This, for reference, is a photograph from the storeroom at the National Museum in Stockholm. This is double-sided, so there's another side of this on the back. And this isn't everything. Although she was the only woman whose work was on display in 1912-13, all 7 exhibits were inspired by the Arctic environment and the Lofoten fishing community. So I quote, And when we then began to glimpse the Lofoten Mountains far in the distance, between the fells of Store and Lille Molla, Anna was completely astonished and seduced. She just sank into a silent adoration. Here I have been before, here I belong, this I have felt before, this is mine, here I must be, and here I must return. This was quoted by her husband in his personal reflections, or minnesanteckningen, published after she died. Out in the waters of Vestfjorden, between the Lofoten Islands and the mainland, is the Lofotveggen, or Lofoten Wall, a collection of mountain peaks composed of granite and volcanic rock, rise from the water and appear to form an almost straight and impenetrable line. Beyond these mountains, so looking towards the Lofoten Islands, is the island of Store Molla, as seen in this painting, and Lille Molla to the northeast, with Stor meaning big and Lille meaning little. These two rocky outcrops, with Store Molla's highest peak, Heggedalstinden, reaching 751 meters, demarcate the entrance to the fishing village of Svolvær. For over 30 years, from 1901 to 1934, Boberg and her husband frequently visited the Arctic. In the Lofoten archipelago, they constructed their own home and studio overlooking Vestfjord and Svolvær harbour, a prominent village in the Norwegian cod and herring fishing industry. The journalist Hanne Astrup Larsen, writing in The Craftsman in 1913, described a, quote, tiny hut on a windswept knoll of the Lofoten Islands is where Anna Boberg lives and paints. She draws her inspiration from the Arctic Sea that stretches to the westward with breakers frothing almost at her feet, and from the mountains that stand guard around her home, end quote. For reference, this building no longer exists. The mound upon which it sits exists, but during the Second World War, it was initially used for target practice by German soldiers, and once it had been destroyed, a munitions bunker was built in its stead. Travelling up in the mountains during the summer in the area surrounding Grundfjord, the Bobergs also built a temporary wooden structure to keep them dry. We'd had enough of the tourists, wrote Boberg, and so they set off to find the ideal spot for Arctic summer fun. This was an isolated spot for bathing, fishing, berry picking, and exploring with their boat. Astrup Larsen further described how, quote, the hut had been placed so that a mountain shut off the sun during the short northern night, which is but a paler day with mists as soft as the dove's wings, end quote. Watercolour sketches, oil paintings, and photographs all characterise these Arctic visits, often painted en plein air or from her Svolvær studio, with several compositions later being worked up back in Stockholm, many overlooking the mountainous coastline of the harbour. A painting from within the National Museum collections denotes a view from my island. The pastel shades of sunset filter through the low-hanging clouds and cast their reflection on the mountains, while ski tracks carve a path through the snow. Boberg remarked how she was, quote, so taken with the Lofoten nature that I simply refused to travel home. I wanted to stay and paint, paint, paint. She also remarks about sending her husband back to Stockholm, having kind of decided she was going to stay there longer, referring to herself as her own master and her own help. As one of the northernmost populated regions in the world, the landscape of the Lofoten archipelago, for those who might not be familiar, has shaped artistic responses to the imaginary of a Nordic landscape for more than several centuries. The Canadian and Scandinavian fascination with the far north is often centred on northern representations and imaginings by southerners, with the romanticisation of the Canadian, Swedish, and Norwegian north, often silencing and excluding Indigenous voices and visual histories. Now, while this is the subject almost entirely for a separate talk, I want to just preface that the extent of the Indigenous territory of Sápmi encompassed the Lofoten Islands. Boberg would have likely encountered and interacted with coastal Sami during her travels to and from the Lofoten Islands, and especially on her trip further north to Hammerfest, from which she painted one of her glacier paintings. And it's, I think, important to recognize this, given that from as far as we've been able to find, there is no representation of Sami in any of her paintings. So there are a few depictions of people generally, but this is, again, something she's very consciously not interested in painting. I'm going to take a little segue just to talk about the glacier painting. It has very little to do with the rest of the talk, but I can't not. And so at some point between 1901 and 1934, Ferdinand proclaimed that I would like to take a look at the glacier that goes and drowns itself in the sea south of Hammerfest. And for reference, Hammerfest is really right up here in the Norwegian, kind of almost Russian border. Among the holiday snaps of Boberg is a photo of her standing before the vast expanse of the ice in the Oksfjordjokeren in Norway. Her easel is positioned in front of her, and the mountainous backdrop is saturated against the Arctic sky. Jagged ridges of perhaps crystalline blue ice emerge from the depths of the crevasses that shape this glacier as it cascades down the mountain. Rocks and debris are visible among the artistic paraphernalia strewn around the artist. She wrote, quote, "And I who had imagined myself as giving an illusory glimpse of a respectable polar researcher," end quote. Presumably taken by her husband, Boberg's closeness to the glacier reaffirms the immersive nature of her practice. And we really know that she starts to get very involved with glaciers. She bathes in glacial streams. There's photographs of her sort of frolicking around in sort of her nightwear with the glacier behind. It's pretty good fun to look at them. So despite the prevalence of Norway, these images often provide no indication of time or date. Boberg appears to have associated timelessness with the Arctic, removing any specificity from her work, from her writing, and during the period from which she resided within the environment. Unlike perhaps the Impressionist penchant for showing a, quote, tiny fragment of time, an instant disconnected from any other, the isolated moment rather than the progression of time, end quote, Boberg's work instead coheres multiple moments of time, often between the golden hour and twilight. Throughout her oeuvre, she offers her perspective on what are arguably two complementary temporal frameworks, from the extended golden hour to the defining moment of twilight, while the latter lines itself more closely with the Impressionist interest in the momentary and the fleeting. Boberg's focus on the shaping effects of light on the colours of the landscape and through the faint graphite markings, which you can just sort of make out here, outlining the peaks of Store Molla, instead builds up layers of time that belies the idea of the momentary. In contrast to the instantaneity of Impressionism, described by Charles Baudelaire as the, quote, ephemeral, the fugitive, and the contingent, end quote, Boberg's Arctic also offers a closer, more intimate insight into the fleetingness and convergence of light and time. By 1915, when the art critic John D. Barry wrote following the Pan-Pacific Exposition, he recorded how, quote, "She's not a servile copyist. She wants us to realize her purpose, which is to catch the effects of light and shade," end quote. Commenting on the Arctic light, Boberg highlighted the multiple colors in the sky and landscape, where golden hour gradually merges with the purple blue of twilight. An awareness of latitude and light is additionally evidenced in her own description of, quote, orgies of color, which in the transition between day and night are celebrated for only a few seconds along the equator, and which here move through their changing splendor over the course of several hours, end quote. Boberg's visual and textual references to climatic phenomena, with the subtle changes of light differentiated by latitude and the changing of the seasons, reappear further throughout her commentary. Quote, "The sea breathed deeply. Mountain islands rose up high, rose right up and down in a silver mist. The last glimpse of the sun had long since been extinguished by the highest peak of Stjärneholdet, but the heavens still bathed in a golden light. And at the same time as the glow faded over the setting sun, dusk crept up on the landscape, an ethereal peacock blue," end quote. In a review, again, of the 1915 Pan-Pacific Exposition, Eugen Neuhaus described the distinctiveness of Boberg's landscapes, an artist who, quote, "When one considers the proverbial clones of the Arctic seas, her interpretations seem marvelous in their beauty and richness of color," end quote. So in relation to Boberg and elsewhere, I've kind of explored the eco-critical possibilities of color, sort of looking through the spectrum of color found in Boberg's paintings in relation to what I have termed elsewhere a tonal eco-criticism. So for those who might not be familiar, I'm going to shoehorn a bit of what eco-critical art history, at least how I approach it, means here, which is allowing for a reading of the material, cultural, and environmental entanglements of color, light, and texture, of paint pigments, graphite, charcoal, ink, of the depiction of trees, lakes, mountains, and ice that become further materially charged when we think about them alongside their respective sort of scientific disciplines, so botany, forestry, mineralogy, and glaciology. Boberg's practice further parallels the palette of the Impressionist landscape. As the Irish poet and critic George Moore remarked, quote, "Broken brushwork and violet shadows lead to only one possible goal, the prismatic colours," end quote. In Night at Store Molla, the ridges of the mountain are tinged purple, the snow reflecting the light cast over the water and scattered rocks that chart a path from the mainland to the island. Beyond the purple, violet, and mauve, the idea of a prismatic palette emanates from Boberg's Lofoten paintings. The visual binaries of colour and light, mountain and fjord, frame what we can see. Her command of the atmospheric effects of light and colour left critics in awe of, quote, the difficulties which she confronted and successfully overcame, end quote, especially as it pertained to painting the aurora borealis. To weather the Arctic climate, a space for so long associated with men proving their mettle, saw her described as brave. Quote, indeed, connoisseurs and art critics alike were surprised not only that northern Norway possessed such superb subjects for the painter, but that it should have been left to a lady artist, who is comparatively a beginner in art, to discover its manifold beauties. I will note, however, the Lofoten Islands are not that cold, so she might have over-egged it a little bit. Similar commentary was given to many women artists working outdoors in all weather. One example here is the Norwegian artist Kitty Kielland, whose work regularly saw her working within boggy, wet, and windswept coastal Norway. As early as the summer of 1878, Kielland wrote in a letter to her colleague, Elif Peterson, quote, "It is a miserable struggle with the fierce wind which drives sand into your head, through your eyes and ears, mixes into all your paints on the palette, and finally covers the whole study. I get so annoyed that I quarrel with it all my might. The wind answers with clouds of sand and violent gusts of wind," end quote. This commitment to painting outdoors often bemused critics and colleagues alike. In a letter to the art historian Jonas Lie, dated June 1886, the artist Erik Werenskjold commented on Kielland's artistic process, quote, "Kitty paints day and night in sun and rain, on country roads and up in the fields. The only thing she could hit on now would be to start climbing the trees and sitting there with her odd painting things," end quote. Despite this sort of apparent gendered framing of weather, the Norwegian art historian, contemporary art historian, Øystein Kjærstad, asks us to look at these landscapes as non-gendered spaces. Yet when we start to think of landscape eco-critically, engaging work by Boberg and Kielland and others in the realities of climate, weather, and geography and biodiversity, we must similarly extend this ecological morality to women and underrepresented communities living and working within these regions. As we start to think of the visual landscape as environment and not just a constructed or imagined space, it needs to become inclusionary rather than exclusionary. Kjærstad writes that in such a landscape, Kielland was free, removed from the restrictions imposed by class and gender, whereby the, quote, "wild nature can thus be looked upon as an emancipating space," end quote. The same might be said of Boberg. A little anecdote which has come up a few times today is that the sort of Parisian socialite Louise Garnier wrote a letter to Boberg several times, confused and questioning why she would choose to spend her time up in Lofoten, dressing like a local, socializing with locals, as opposed to dressed in her finery in Paris and enjoying the social scene. These paintings cannot simply be reduced to twilight or nocturnal landscapes. They more widely underscore an environmental intimacy in the artist's oeuvre, where watery landscapes emerge from rain-soaked, wind-swept, snow-covered, and early evening excursions. Writing for the 1912-13 catalogue, Brinton described, quote, "those huge mountains rising out of the sea, surrounded by fleets of fishing," end quote, that characterized Boberg's paintings. Although we are unable to date most of Boberg's paintings, we do know that she was painting during the renaissance of small boats and simple line fishing, which reached similar peak levels in the 1920s as in the late 19th century. This, by the way, is where I now segue into talking about fishing, so please bear with me. Not only was Boberg painting during the heyday of the Lofotfisket, or the Lofoten fishery, but also one of its last flourishes. In her diaries, she records the modernization of this local industry. Quote, "Who, at the time of my earlier visits to Lofoten, could imagine that this millennial fairy tale would soon be at an end? That the power of the motor would, in a staggeringly short time, end tradition. The slow hammering of the oars was replaced by the engine's rapid bangs. Pure sailing was over forever. The fishing boat and its bigger sister, the hunting vessel, will survive only as museum objects." She returns frequently to the depiction of the boat, and here I want to draw attention to the hunting vessel. We can see it here in 3 paintings, heavily loaded and perhaps sea-bound in the blue boat, and in fishing boats Lofoten, Norway, on the other side. Where these 2 paintings showcase the hunting vessel resplendent with its billowing sails, the unusual cropping of the composition in another of Boberg's paintings, fishing boats with the empty masks extending beyond the picture plane, go further to suggest their impressive scale. Seen together, these 3 paintings provide a narrative of scale and movement, of the ships moored in the harbour and travelling to and from the open sea. Astrup Larsson wrote that, quote, "The fishing boats, as Anna Boberg paints them, are personalities, eloquent with stories," end quote. Memorialising the Lofoten fishery was also prevalent in the work of several 19th century Norwegian painters. Otto Sinding, Adelstin Norman, and Gunnar Berg, all of whom favoured the continued presence of the traditional vessels. Boberg's vibrant landscapes and seascapes, including fishing boats, similarly participate in this cultural geographic shift. And to tell you what's going on in this painting would require more time, so feel free to ask me at the end. Local fishermen were not, however, entirely opposed to modern developments, but nevertheless pushing against tradition led to repeated confrontation between, quote, fishermen who used traditional open boats and modern entrepreneurs and capitalist ship owners. Until the 1860s, the Nordland boat, as it's referred, this is the Nordland boat here, had been widely used by Norwegian fishermen rowing and sailing north and south of Lofoten. Often made of either pine or spruce, these boats were painted with thick bands of colour encircling the top. In contrast, the larger vessels were often blocked out in complementary shades of yellow, blue, red, or green. Despite the introduction of modernised boats towards the end of the 19th century, the open-topped Nordland boat remained a common favourite among Lofoten fishermen. And I'll say that we see this in a lot of Anna Boberg's work, is this attention to the colour of the Nordland boat in particular. The hunting vessel is a little more rare. I'll also add that the fact that we see even the outline of figures here is again unique within her oeuvre. Paintings including Boberg's view from Lofoten depict the fishing fleet moored in the harbour, bathed in the light of the golden hour, with the setting of the sun, pink reflections ripple across the fjord, casting the boats in a red silhouette. They take on here a different form as misty yellows shape the ridges and crevices of the mountain, and we really get, as you might have noticed, she's working in different styles and different approaches to the handling of paint and colour throughout her career. But because of this lack of dating and timelessness, we can't develop that nice, orderly chronology that art historians tend to favour. Instead, we have to just sort of see these within this 30-year period, sort of disconnected from time. This commitment to the Lofoten lifestyle also manifested in her purchasing her own little boat, the Puttan, which she managed and used herself and allowed for her to fish and paint in and around the fjords. Boberg devised her own special type of palette, which we saw back on an earlier slide, which would be strapped to her person so that she could paint on a rocking boat and miss no shifting play of sun and wind on the churning sea. So she developed this contraption that would attach to her thighs and to her waist and have the easel kind of in front of her there. She was not alone in using the boat as a painterly tool. The Swedish landscape painter Josefina Holmlund, a contemporary of Boberg's, was known to have painted from aboard a rowing boat. Charles-François Dominy devised a floating studio that featured a series of etchings titled The Boat Trip. Monet built a studio boat in the mid-1870s, allowing him to paint from the perspective of the waterline, and Canadian artists, including the likes of Tom Thompson, often painted from the sunken vantage point of the canoe. In her writing, Boberg also distinguished herself as, quote, a passionate amateur fisherman who went out in a small boat to try and catch cod with a line and hook, and was apparently very successful. While she removes herself from her own paintings, several family photographs, as we see here, taken by her husband, show her dressed in waterproof overalls, rowing and catching fish. This photograph, I think both of these photographs here on the right, were taken from their hut on Grundfjord that we saw earlier, where they were having breakfast, which Boberg described as a place where, quote, for fishermen, what an El Dorado. Cod and flounder in the fjord and salmon in the rapids in the lake, end quote. And for, yes, as you can see, the exclamation point after the 13 cod, I think, really lend to their unexpected success. Fishing boats is also particularly evocative of other works, such as, I think this distinctive comparison is quite satisfying, as Egon Schieler's Hafen von Trieste, painted in 1907. Contemporaneous with Boberg's earlier trips to the Lofoten Islands, Schieler's painting abstracts the reflections of the vivid coloured hulls and masts into swirling patterns upon the water's surface. Where in Boberg's painting, the reflected colours of the Nordland boats rest in a mismatched pattern upon gently moving waves, Schieler scores the wet paint with a pencil or the opposite end of a paintbrush. During a brief stint in prison in 1912, Schieler wrote in his prison journal, quote, I dreamt of Trieste, of the sea of open space. Longing, oh longing. For comfort, I painted myself a ship, colourful and big-bellied, like those that rock back and forth on the Adriatic. In it, longing and fantasy can sail over the sea, far out to distant islands, where jewel-like birds glide and sing among incredible trees. Oh, sea? This pan-European evocation of ships and the sea offer further possible ways of framing Boberg's harbour and fishing scenes beyond the Arctic. While the setting of Schieler's painting is markedly different, reflecting instead the built-up harbour of Trieste on the Adriatic coast, like Boberg, it explores the visual binaries of colour and light, framing what we can see. These nuances of colour also emerge in the snow occupying the foreground of the blue roof, which is unusually limited in its colour palette. Only the shock of the yellow building and lapis blue roof disrupts the shades of pink, blue, grey and white of this built-up coastline. The idea that the purple, pink and white brushstrokes of the snow might also denote rock completely eludes the viewer, the light bouncing off snow that deflects the reality of the situation. It accounts for the, quote, vibration of air inundated with light, as Edmond Duranty once remarked. The close-cropped perspective guiding the eye down the snowy slope towards the yellow house and ultimately the water surrounding the jetty places the viewer and by proxy the artist within the landscape. The importance of the shoreline storehouse also appears in the backdrop to fishing boats, a salmon pink structure earlier on, visible between the crisscrossing ropes and masts with different angles of the same building appearing in other of Boberg's sketches. The blue roof, however, is especially important in this regard for drawing attention to the social and cultural implications of the Lofotfisket. While the exact location of the painting is unknown, it is unique in its infrastructural emphasis. Although Boberg has cropped the composition in such a way that the height and depth of the surrounding environment is obscured, the focus on the structures and coastlines contributes to the ongoing narrative of the fishing industry in many of her other Lofoten landscapes. It is likely that many of these buildings out on the jetty were storehouses for the boats coming into harbour. The yellow and blue building is more likely to be domestic, perhaps lived in by one of the fishermen or dock workers, or even a storehouse. These buildings likely stored herring or codfish, the former which had driven, quote, transatlantic commerce as a staple of both European diet and the Atlantic slave trade, end quote. And there was brief mention of a new research discovery. If you're an art historian and you've ever started to put together a talk and presentation slides before the talk, you tend to get distracted very easily by archives. And it turns out that I spent 2 hours on a weekend finding that this photo had been digitized only this summer, wondering if I'd missed it in my many years of research. And I noticed a very familiar composition in the top left. And it turns out from a few conversations with the National Museum that it appears that this blue roof is an en plein air sketch, and this one is a studio finished work. This photograph is of Anna right before she died. And so further research is required, but I think there's something really indicative that among the paintings she's choosing to pose in front of right before she dies is the blue roof. In writing about the local fishing community, Boberg described the economic value of the catch, where, quote, with larger fish, your pockets are stuffed with lovely banknotes and your debts to the bank repaid, end quote. Racks of drying stockfish, a product to the local area, mark the landscape to this day and are also visible in several works. So she's really commenting on the transformative effect fishing has on the landscape, the coastline, and lesser so on the individuals working in this industry. Beyond this, factories were constructed in the area during the second half of the 19th century. The first herring oil factory was constructed in Svolvær in 1898 and actually is the subject of another painting by Boberg. Earlier that century, the production of guano fertilizer using fish heads and other waste was built in Svolvær, the first of its kind in Europe, in fact. Beyond these, Boberg also painted several iterations of the whale oil factory, with tall chimneys emitting plumes of smoke suffocating the sky and concealing the land beyond. The North Atlantic and Norwegian marine environment was at one time dominated by whaling vessels, with the Lofoten Islands up until the early 21st century providing most of Norway's whale meat. While the blue roof does not directly represent any of these industries, it is important to see it as part of this series of paintings, alongside her more prevalent scenes of fishing vessels moored in the harbour, documenting those human activities on the shoreline. Beyond the boats, which we can only glimpse at in the far left corner, much of the commercial enterprise of fishing took place on the shore. As André Tavares recently wrote in Architecture Follows Fish, which if you haven't read, it's very good read, quote, biology, technology, processing, politics, and consumption are lenses to help us perceive just how intimately entangled fishing and terrestrial landscapes are, end quote. Piscatorial architecture, as he terms it, offers, quote, built manifestations of the human presence within nature. In an article published in the Studio following the exhibition of Boberg's work in Paris in 1905, the author wrote that her paintings represented, quote, a sort of epitome of the life of the sailors of the north of Norway, their departure with the fishing fleet, their return in storm or calm, and their arrival in some sheltered harbour, end quote. Boberg's local knowledge and intimate perspective of the Lofoten landscape allows for a more comprehensive and continuous understanding of this coastal Arctic environment than is often historically available. So, accounting for the nuances of working within the Lofoten Islands, Boberg's artwork, when viewed in relation to the environment in which it was made, might also be regarded as part of a larger discussion of landscape painting around the Circumpolar North and Arctic. As I've sort of tried to allude to through some of the examples I've given today, but I'm going to be a bit more direct in my conclusion. When the 1912-13 exhibition passed through Buffalo in January 1913, the Canadian landscape painters J.H. MacDonald and Lauren S. Harris travelled across the border to see the display. Though the Armory show, as we've heard, subdued the impact of Scandinavian modernism for American art at large, it was no less than a revelation and indeed a turning point in Canadian art. It gets a little prophetical if you study Canadian art history, but MacDonald and Harris would later form part of the Canadian Artists Collective under the moniker The Group of Seven. In a lecture given at the Art Gallery of Toronto, now the Art Gallery of Ontario, in 1931, MacDonald reminisced about the transformative power of this 1913 encounter with landscape painting of the Scandinavian painters. He remarked that, quote, this is what we want to do with Canada, end quote. He noted an affinity of inspiration with these Scandinavian painters, writing, quote, we were so fond of these things ourselves that we couldn't but like the pictures, and we were all well assured that no Swedish brook or river would speak a language unknown to us, and that we would know our own snows and rivers better. Of the Swedish artist Fjärstad, he hailed the artworks as, quote, true souvenirs of that mystic north round which we all revolve. And I will say that I tried to find his comments on Anna Boberg, but past me chose not to save those, and it's very difficult to find a copy of this, so forgive me for not sharing his thoughts on her specifically. MacDonald's invocation of a mystic north looms large in how art historians have understood both Scandinavian and Canadian modernism in the decades framing the turn of the century. But I found it more rewarding to consider the stakes of the geographical position round which we all revolve. In other words, those places physically situated around the Arctic Circle in degrees of latitude. The geography, topography, and ecology of circumpolar landscape painting emerge as complex but simultaneous recurrent systems around similar gradients of latitude. Boberg's Lofoten paintings, from her mountain landscapes such as Night at Storemølla through to the shoreline industry of the Lofotfisket in the Blue Roof and her incredible Northern Lights, are important for underscoring this idea of an environment and industry that transcends national borders. If we think back to the start of this talk, when Boberg's work was shown in the 1912-13 exhibition, she was exhibited as under the Swedish section, and yet none of her exhibited works were of Sweden. Now, we might get into the conversation that Norway was still part of the Swedish Empire at that point, but I think this idea of a shared environment identity across geographical borders was already apparent, and Brinton didn't even realize it. Seen more broadly, Boberg's work contributes to ongoing research within art history and environmental history around the shoreline, the importance of prominent Arctic, European, and by extension, North Atlantic fishing trades, and of an artistic economy in the late 19th and early 20th century. When viewed transnationally and ecocritically, Boberg's paintings and landscape painting more broadly might further serve as historical interlocutors or laboratories through which to contend with both our environmental histories and current global crises. Thank you. Any questions?
I have a question.
Use the microphone. Sorry.
Oh yeah, sure, why not? Thanks. Thank you so much for your talk. I have just a really quick question. You talked about the Scandinavian painters and the Canadian painters as sharing some commonalities. Was there an equivalent Russian painting practice?
So, forgive me if there are Russian art historians in the audience. Not my area of expertise. I made a very conscious decision to, often Nordic art historians tend to look towards Russia. You're a Nordic and Russian art historian rather than a Nordic and Canadian art historian. There are several paintings in the early 1900s by sort of like Korovin of Hammerfest, which I think are really interesting. So Korovin's a Russian landscape painter of sort of Siberia that I touch upon a little bit in the PhD thesis for a sense of completeness. As I said, I'm not a Russian art historian, but there are landscape painting during the early 20th century of the Russian Arctic. Louise Hardeman is a great scholar of Russian art, and she's just published a paper recently on the Russian Arctic and landscape painting. So I advise checking out her work rather than listening to me ramble on. So thank you.
You're fine. You're fine. Hi, Dr. Gapp. Thank you so much for the talk. I had no prior knowledge of Scandinavian art or this artist at all until today, and I feel like I've learned a lot, so thank you. I was wondering, you spoke a little bit about how Boberg separated herself from the tourists, quote unquote, but also there's little mention of perhaps the Sami or other communities in her work or in her journals or anything like that. And I was wondering what you make of her, and the answer to my question might be in the question itself, because she is, a landscape artist, but I was wondering what you made of her reluctance to display the communities that make up the sort of the places that she was trying to depict in her work, whether it's the tourists or the indigenous communities or any other community. I was wondering what you made of that.
So, I mean, short answer is, and I do write about this in my book, because the Canadian group of 7, they do the same thing. I mean, I think the short answer is she's a landscape painter, and she's interested in industry, but not necessarily interested in the individuals participating in this industry. Now, there are examples of it, but it's not the core focus. I once had somebody dispute my comment in a paper that I said she doesn't depict the Sami, and they went, well, actually, there's one painting. And I went, that does not dispute my argument. But I think there is this tendency, in my book, I write a whole chapter on the wilderness and on this idea of the wilderness in landscape painting, especially around the Circumpolar North, crossing over with ideas of the frontier and the periphery and sort of borders and how we conceive of these spaces within landscape art history more generally. And I think that artists such as Anna Boberg, the group of 7, working at this time during the early 20th century, this idea of the wilderness is still very pervasive in how they are understanding and interacting with the landscape. I have found it really important in my work to preface that how artists got to these places. She could get a train to the Lofoten Islands. This is not Robert Peary and Matthew Henson off to the North Pole. This is getting on a train in Stockholm and traveling up to Narvik, courtesy of an iron ore mine. So I've tried with my work to sort of address this sort of depopulated landscape, both of animals and people, as part of this overarching wilderness narrative that is so sort of omnipresent in landscape painting. That's the more kind of convoluted artist where I think some artists are intentionally not including people. Boberg is one of those, but there's also on the other side that artistic preference for painting the landscape as opposed to painting sort of, I don't know, birds and deer. Although Fjerstad is again interesting, Gustav Fjerstad, you'll get a lot of the time the kind of footprints of animals. So he's alluding to the fact that the animal was once in the landscape, but very rarely depicting the animal itself. So thank you for that question.
Thanks. Thank you so much. You mentioned there was another version of this painting that was depicted in the photograph, but I guess, can you talk more about that, I guess? Or have you seen both of them, or?
I learned this on Sunday.
Okay, okay, never on Sunday, all right.
No is the short answer to that one.
Okay.
So what I can tell you is, so the National Museum in Stockholm have not yet really done a great job of digitizing her work, but as you could probably tell, there's a lot of it. I do know that its scale is quite different. It's about 91 centimeters wide, as opposed to the 50 centimeters that we have here. So it is a decent size bigger. Which was the first thing that made me realize that this wasn't this painting. It's apparently on long-term loan to a Swedish agency. Don't know what that is either. But a photograph has been requested on my behalf, so hopefully we'll get a better sense of the differences. You can kind of glean it a little bit, but the nature of the photograph doesn't really allow for much comparison. But no, it's interesting because there are very few examples of where she's taking the en plein air sketch and working it up into a kind of studio work, a larger scale studio work. Most of these larger scale studio works also are not just in the National Museum archives, but now that I've learned that they're on long-term loan places, my sense is that a lot of these paintings are just elsewhere. You might have already also picked up on that this is the view of my island. Which again is larger than the one I showed you. So we've got two examples here of that en plein air painting to the studio work. Now, whether this is studio finished work in her Lofoten studio or she's, working this up back in Stockholm, I don't know. But as of Sunday, I'm now looking at this again.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm curious about whether there was a market during her lifetime for her work. And if so, who were gravitated to her work? And maybe I'm assuming that it was a certain urban elite who were, part of a changing society. And, I can't help but look at these pictures and think about where we are right now here in Maine, and places like Monhegan Island, which attracted artists like Rachel Kent and George Bellows and Robert Henry and Edward Hopper, all New Yorkers who came from the city and found something authentic in this sort of timeless, mythic coastal landscape. And I'm wondering if there's something similar at work in Boberg's work.
So it's a good question. She received various degrees of kind of positive and negative feedback during her life. She exhibits quite frequently. So she exhibits at, I think, 3 or 4 Venice Biennales. She has her solo show in Paris in 1905. She's exhibited at several of the big kind of fairs and expositions in the US. She doesn't seem to have been shown in Sweden. And my working hypothesis around that is that she's not depicting Sweden. Every other Swedish artist, by and large, at that time is depicting Sweden if they're a landscape painter. So and Swedish art has a tendency to get caught up either with France or of its own artists. And I think that geopolitical tension with Norway at a time where it becomes its own country during the time she's working there, I think contributes to that. As for kind of collectors and who's buying, so this goes back to sort of the question around the nature of these bigger pieces to a large degree is, I don't really know where they are. They're either in the National Museum collections, and there are around 120, 150 pieces by her in the National Museum collection that have not been digitized. And so without trawling through measurements to get a sense of these larger scale pieces, because these are the ones she's exhibiting, by and large. I believe that there are probably quite a few pieces in private collections that were acquired off of these fairs. So there's one in Venice. There is one in Venice that was clearly acquired following a biennale. But I don't really have much of a sense for that buyer reaction to her work, why they were buying her work. Mainly because I don't really know where the works are, other than several collections in North America, and there's one in Paris, there's one in Oslo. But how they ended up there, why they ended up there, I don't know the answer. It's one of the kind of big looming questions of how much was sold during her lifetime versus how much did they sort of hoard and then leave to the National Museum after her death, is sort of one of the unanswered questions. So thank you.
This kind of goes back to our conversation about the studio paintings and the outdoor paintings, and I have a feeling you would have said this if this is true in your talk, but I'm wondering, this is sort of like well past the time that painters are getting involved with photography. I'm wondering whether it's possible that, there's some kind of archive of her photographs, or whether she took any photographs. Okay. All right, cool.
So
that's the other thing. Like, these compositions are weird. Like the one that is at Bowdoin right now, that's a very odd cropping,
and it's
to my eye.
It's an odd cropping in her work as well. Like, it's one of the things that struck me when I saw this was it isn't, if you look at these other examples, these are much more typical of her work, of these mountainous backdrops. I think at one point I said that not in this talk, but elsewhere I wrote that the mountain is like constant presence in the background of her paintings. And then this one comes along and I'm like, okay, it's not. But in terms of photographs, and I've been to the Royal Library Archives, which is where all of the photographs are, except for this one. They're just holiday snaps. They're just holiday snaps of them having breakfast, frolicking in glacial rivers, building buildings. It's that she's really, and most of her works are sketches, so she's really just working a lot in sketch form and in drawings as well. So there is a sketchbook. I haven't seen it. It hasn't been digitized. So that is also, I think, going to be interesting to see how she's working with the graphite sketch as opposed to the oil sketch, but she's not using photographs. Gustav Fjestad is. So he's the one with the snow and landscape. He is using photographs, which I think, again, has that awkward cropping of the composition. He is using photographs to work from. She's not. So
Thank you.
it doesn't help with the whole, it's awkward. But
No, I mean, it feels very spontaneous. It
Yeah.
doesn't feel like it's painted from a
Yeah.
photograph. So yeah, thanks.
Perhaps one final question, Liz?
So I'm just curious, and I may have gotten this wrong, but it sounds as though her marriage ended up having a pretty major impact on her having access to the art world. And I'm just wondering, to what extent, how does her work differ from that of her husband?
I would say it's the other way around.
Oh, okay.
So she's the more socially well-connected one than he is. So her father is a very
Gotcha.
He's a very well-connected, important architect. The reason why the mum is hesitant about her marrying Ferdinand is because he's kind of a nobody in terms of social status.
Mm-hmm.
My working hypothesis is he becomes quite successful, very successful. He's responsible for most of the major buildings in Stockholm and throughout Sweden. His drawings, his artwork is much more with watercolors and with pencil. It's much more formulaic. It's less kind of there's less creative flourish to it. It's much more like, this is a building, I draw the building, moving on. I think she definitely then reciprocally benefited from him being, say, commissioned to design the Swedish pavilion at one of the Venice Biennales. And he did several other Swedish pavilions at other world's fairs. So I do think she probably was able to ride the coattails of that success to reach more international audiences. But in terms of social connection, they were they both managed to really equally work to be part of it. And I think, and this is very non-academic and scholarly of me, but I think he would be very disappointed that his wife's art got relegated and his architecture kind of continued to have this legacy, because he very much saw them as a kind of like a power couple. It was each of them worthy of their own success, supporting each other through everything. And so the fact that Swedish art history and wider art history has kind of relegated her to the side and put him up on a platform, I think it doesn't line up with how they lived their lives and saw each other's careers. So I think there's a lot of work to do to kind of get her up there with him as art historians and architectural historians and sort of people in the field. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's fascinating.
Maybe that's a good note on which to conclude. And Isabelle, I want to say thank you for doing so much work to return her to the visibility she deserves. This was a fascinating talk. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your wonderful questions and observations. And please join me in thanking Isabelle Gapp.